In this lecture, we'll see how to define a property and why we need to define one. When we define a property, we add a new attribute to the class. First, let us see the syntax with the help of an example. We have this class where we have these two instance variables and this method display. We define another method and inside this method, we are just returning the value of this variable underscore x. Let's run this. We can call this method like this. Now here before this method, we'll add a line at the rate property. Now after adding this line, this name value has become a property. We can access it like we access an instance variable. Let's run this. Now we write p dot value and we could access the value of this variable underscore x. So the code of this method was executed, but there was no need of putting the parenthesis here. You could access it as if it was an instance variable. This at the rate property is a decorator. We'll learn about decorators later on. So when we decorate a method with this line, that method can be accessed like an instance variable instead of as a method. We can use this p dot value in an expression like this. So by defining this property, we have added a new attribute that can be accessed like an instance variable. We can see this new attribute using the dir function. So we can see this new attribute here. Now let's try to assign something to this attribute named value. We got this attribute error. So although a new attribute has been defined, we can only reference it. We can't assign anything to it. For that, we have to define another method, and in that method, we'll write the code that will be executed when we assign something to this attribute value. So now here we define another method. Name of this method is also value. It takes one parameter after the self. And inside this method, we have this one line of code. Now the important point here is that we have to put one line here. So now whenever we assign anything to this attribute value, this method's code will be executed. The value that is assigned will be the argument for the second parameter of this method. Let's run this. So now we were able to assign to this attribute named value. So whenever we'll reference this attribute named value, this method will be executed, and whenever we'll assign something to it, this method will be executed. This is the getter method and this is the setter method for this property. This name should be same in both the methods, and the setter method accepts an argument which is used for setting the property. Now let's create one more property. Name of this property is y. So this is the getter method for this property. Let's write the setter method. So when you reference this y, this method will be executed, and when you assign something to this, then this method will be executed. In this method, we are returning the value of variable underscore y, and in this method, we are setting the value of this variable underscore y. Let's run this. So you can see that by defining this property named value, we are referencing and assigning to this variable underscore x. And by defining this property named y, we are referencing and assigning to this variable underscore y. So you can reference or assign to the property using the syntax of an instance variable. But under the covers, the method code is getting executed. Now after seeing the syntax, let us see why we need to use properties. We have this class person with these two instance variables name and age and this method display. Now suppose after some time you want to ensure that whenever age is assigned a value, that value should be within the range 20 to 80. One possible solution could be to make age a private variable and define a set age method in which we can put the validation code. So let's do this. We make this age a private variable by prefixing it with an underscore. Here also we change it. And now we'll define the set age method in which we'll change the value of age. So this is the set age method. We are raising a value error if the new age is not within this range. Now this underscore age is a private variable. So client is not supposed to access it directly. So we have to define a getAge method also. So now when the user wants to change the age, he'll do it through this setAge method and the data validation will be done. Let's run this. So it did not allow us to set this age. Again, we got this error. This time the age was within the range, so we did not get any error. And the age was changed. So this update in the class successfully implemented the new restriction on age. Now suppose the user wants to increase the current age by 1. So first you'll get the current age using this method getAge, add 1 to it, and then you'll send this value to setAge. So the age was increased by 1, but this statement looks very awkward. And there is still a problem in this code. When the user creates a new object, he can send any value for the age because there is no data validation done in the initializer. For example, we create a new object here. So we need to put the data validation in the initializer also. So now we have put the data validation in this initializer also. Let's run this. Now we create this new instance and it showed us this error. So now the data validation is done here also when we create a new instance object. Now this code works, but it is not Pythonic. We are repeating the same code at 2 places, and another problem, which is a big one, is that it breaks the existing client code. There may be a lot of client code that access the attribute age directly. All that has to be changed. For example, this client code will not work now because the instance variable is now underscore age and not age. So here the client has to change this p.age to p.setAge and this p.age to p.getAge. So our new update is not backward compatible. It breaks the interface. The Pythonic way of going about this whole thing would be to create a property. So this time let's create a property to add the data validation for attribute age. We had this person class previously. Now instead of the setAge and getAge methods, now we'll create a property here. Now we'll define the setter method. So in this setter method, we have put this data validation. So now we can easily access age as an instance variable and the data validation is also done. Let's run this. We can access age like this. This age was within the range, so it was changed. We did not get any error. This was outside the range, so we got this error. Let's create a new instance variable. We did not change the initializer, but the validation is done here also. It is done because this property method is called here. Since age is now a property and we are assigning to age here. Now if we have to add 1 to the current age, we can easily do it. Or we can write. You can see this is much more concise and cleaner than it was using the setAge and getAge methods approach. Now let's run the existing client code and see. So this code is also working smoothly. No changes need to be done in this existing code. So your changes to the class are backward compatible. So when you need to perform some data validation on an existing instance attribute, you can turn it into a property. Another use of property is that you can make an instance variable read-only or write-only. If you provide only the getter method, not the setter method, the property becomes a read-only property. Let's see this with the help of an example. Here in this class, we have defined three properties: name, password, and salary. For this property name, we have defined only the getter method. We have not defined the setter method. So this property becomes a read-only property. This attribute name is read-only. This attribute password is write-only because in this getter method, we have raised this attribute error. If you provide both the getter and the setter methods, the property becomes read-write property. So this attribute salary can both be referenced and assigned to. It is a read-write attribute. Now let's run this. This name attribute is read-only. If we try to assign something to it, we can't. We get this error. Then this password attribute is not readable. We get this error, password not readable, but we can assign to it. This salary attribute is both readable and writable. We can read it and also write to it. So property allows you to make an attribute read only or write only. Let us see one more example of using property. In this rectangle class, we have these three instance variables: length, breadth, and diagonal, and two methods, area and perimeter. The value of this instance variable diagonal is computed from the values of these two instance variables, length and breadth. Let's run this. We create a new instance. Let's see the diagonal. This is the value of diagonal. This is the area. And this is the perimeter. Now let us change the length. Now let's see the diagonal. Diagonal has not changed. Now the area is this. And the perimeter also shows the changed value. So area and perimeter have changed because they are implemented as methods. But this diagonal has not changed. So if you change the value of an instance variable, any other instance variable that is computed from it will not automatically update. So here in this class, if we change length or breadth, diagonal will not change accordingly. Now one solution could be to implement diagonal as a method, but then we'll not be able to access it as an instance variable. Whenever we want to access it, we have to put the parenthesis. This will also break existing client code who have used diagonal as an instance variable. So the solution is to turn it into a property. So let's change it to a property. Now this diagonal is a property. So now we can continue to access diagonal as an instance variable, and whenever we'll access diagonal, we'll get the updated value. Let's run this. We create a new instance object. Diagonal is this. Now we change the length. Now we see the diagonal. Now the diagonal has also changed. And there is no need to define the setter method for this property because we don't expect the user to change the diagonal. This is the first example that we had seen in this lecture. Now, in addition to the getter and setter methods, we can also define a deleter method for the property. This deleter method defines what happens when a property is deleted. To create this deleter method, you have to define a method with the same name as the property and add this decorator with this word deleter in it. So when we'll delete this attribute, this method will be executed. Let's run this. Now we write del p dot value. So this method was executed. Now let us summarize whatever we have learned about properties. A property allows access to an instance variable through methods, even though the method syntax is not used. Using the property syntax, we can define methods that are automatically called when an instance variable referenced, assigned, or deleted. For getting a property, you need to write this line just above the method definition. For setting a property, you have to write this line, and for deleting a property, you need to write this line. The names of these methods are same, and all of them take self as the first argument, and the setter method takes an additional argument for setting the value of the property. You can use a property for attribute type checking and validation. You can create a read-only or write-only attribute using property. You can transform an instance variable into a dynamically calculated attribute. You can incorporate new behavior in your instance variables without any need to rewrite the existing client code. So you can use a property to give new functionality to existing instance variables. So you can start implementing your class by coding your instance variables as public, and in future if you need more control over any instance variable, you can change it to a private attribute and write a property to access it. This way there will be no change in the existing code that uses the class. Now in the property getter and setter methods, don't perform actions that are surprising or take much time. Referencing or assigning to an attribute is something that the client will expect to run instantly. So it is not advisable to run other helper methods in the property methods. If a task is very complex and time consuming and may have side effects, consider putting it in a separate normal method.